All right, in this video I want to talk a little bit about pistols. When I talk about pistols, what I'm really referring to are handguns. I personally have this habit of referring to a semi-automatic, anything with a slide that actuates back and forth, as a pistol, and these are revolvers. They are revolvers, but they're also technically pistols as well. I'm not talking about something like this, an AR-15 pistol that has a flexible arm brace and not a stock. This is not the intention of this video, is to talk about those types of guns. I want to stick with the traditional, handguns. When we typically, until at least recent memory, when we think of a pistol, we think of something like this. Basically, what we have are different types of actions. And I really want to talk about the difference between double action, single action, and striker fired pistols. There are also single shot pistols, which literally only hold one cartridge at a time, which are pretty self-explanatory. They could be a bolt type action like you'd have on a rifle. They could be a break open action, but basically they hold one shot and one shot only. Those are pretty basic, I think easy for most people to grasp. It holds a single round, therefore it is a single shot. And we'll also talk about double action only, although I don't have one here to demonstrate, but I think we can get through that. So let's start by talking about single action. And I'm going to move the other guns out of the way. I have here a revolver and a pistol that are both single action. So what does that mean? Well, basically what it means is that a single action gun, or a single action handgun, has only one single way to fire. And that means that the gun has to first be cocked. Okay, and this one, it's real easy to see. It's an old school revolver. And I can cock the hammer and then I can pull the trigger. When I pull the trigger, that will release the hammer. It will fire one round. If the hammer is not cocked, pulling the trigger does absolutely nothing. So, you can't simply pull the trigger and get this to fire. You have to cock it and then pull the trigger, secondly. Now, if it's already in a cocked position, you can hold the trigger down and then continue to cock it, and it will release and fire every time. But again, it has to be manually cocked. Even if the trigger is held down, you still have to manually cock this in order to get it to fire. Okay, so that is what we mean by single action. In terms of semi-automatic, single action really is the same thing. The gun has to first be cocked in order to fire. Now, if the hammer is down, pulling the trigger does absolutely nothing. The primary difference here is that in a semi-automatic, the action of cocking the hammer happens automatically. I could, load this magazine, right? If I had a loaded magazine, insert it into the gun. I could cycle the action to get around in the chamber. And then I could, pull the trigger immediately because the cycling of the action cocked the gun. We're not intending to, change what this really is. It is still single action. I did cock it. Just because I didn't put my thumb on here and pull this back doesn't mean I didn't cock it. The action of cycling the slide does the cocking for me. So at this point, a pull of the trigger will cycle the gun once and once only. Now, on a semi-automatic, of course, when I pull the trigger, and I'll cock this again, and I'll demonstrate this. I'll try to hold the trigger from behind so you can see this. When I pull the trigger, the hammer will fall. Now, I'm not going to release the trigger. I'm going to hold it to the rear. In a few milliseconds, this action would start to cycle backwards. It would eject the empty round, cock the hammer, and then pick up a new round and go forward. Now, notice I haven't released the trigger. When I release it, it resets the trigger, and now on a second pull, it would drop the hammer to fire again. If I repeat the process, again, you notice that it did not fall. I am holding the trigger to the rear. It will not automatically go off. It's not a full automatic gun. So it requires a second release and then a pull of the trigger every time in order to fire this. This is semi-automatic. But the important thing for today's discussion really is the fact that it is single action. You will see in countless movies where the bad guy, or maybe the good guy, I suppose, under certain circumstances, has a pistol like this. This is a 1911 style pistol, the quote unquote Colt 45, or the big Desert Eagle pistol, the big behemoth with the triangular shaped barrel on the front, and you'll see the bad guy pull up and he'll go click, 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 like, oh my God, I'm out of ammo, my gun malfunctioned. Well, it won't go click because the clicking you hear is the hammer falling, and the hammer can't fall unless it's been cocked manually, and if the gun malfunctions, of course, the hammer will not be in the back position for at least more than one pull of the trigger. So again, that is kind of fake news, if you will. So I'm going to set these aside as single actions, okay? And then we're going to pull up two more handguns, and we'll talk about double action. So if single action means you have to cock the gun first in order to fire it, double action must imply that there's another option, and there is. And again, we'll look at the revolver first because it's easier to see. On a double action revolver, I could cock the hammer and then pull the trigger, okay? That's an option. Just like on the old revolver here, this old Beretta, okay? I could manually cock it and then pull the trigger, and pulling the trigger here, again, does nothing. On a double action revolver, pulling the trigger actually does something. It cycles the hammer, it rotates the cylinder, and it drops the hammer to fire it. So this is like a semi-automatic pistol in that I can just keep pulling the trigger to fire over and over again. However, I have the option of simply cocking it and then pulling the trigger if I wanted perhaps a more precise shot. Keep in mind that on a single action revolver, or a double action, when it's in the cocked position, it takes relatively low force on the trigger to drop the hammer. But in the case of a double action gun, it takes a lot of force because I'm cocking the hammer and I'm rotating the cylinder all with that action, okay? So again, double action means there are two options. Let's look at the same example in a semi-automatic pistol. And again, I'm going to drop the magazine so the slide won't lock back on me, okay? Again, if I start off with the hammer in the down position, I have the option to cock it. And then again, I can pull the trigger to fire it. Or I can simply pull the trigger and notice the hammer is cocking on its own. I could continue to do that all day long. So if the bad guy in the movie had a Beretta, he could have the gun, go click, and then he could, I don't know why you would, but you could simply pull again and continue to fire. That's at least realistic. I'll leave it at that. However, again, on a semi-automatic, when you first load it, if I put a loaded magazine in, I would typically cycle the action and it would be in the cocked position to begin with. So if I was ready to shoot immediately, I could simply fire. Again, I'm holding the trigger to the rear like I did before. The action would cycle, it recocks it, and it requires a release of the trigger. Again, I'll try to pull this from behind. A release to reset it, and then a second pull to get it to cycle again. Okay, that is again double action. Now on a lot of double action pistols, the hammer functions as a decocker, the safety functions as a decocker. So when I rotate this, the firing pin, which is right here, is physically rotated out of battery. The firing pin turns and the hammer drops. And that way when this is in your holster, the hammer isn't in the rearward cocked position where it would only require a touch of the trigger to set it off. So again, that is, just a basic feature. And I'll talk safety features on pistols at some other time. But for right now, recognize that double action again means I have the option of cocking it and firing it, or I have a second option of simply pulling the trigger to cycle that. So I'll set these two aside, and we'll talk about the last two that I have here on display. this pistol, this is a 40 caliber Smith & Wesson M&P pistol, and this is what we call a striker fired pistol. Essentially, there's no hammer on this. There's no hammer on the back for me to cock. This pistol is actuated by a striker. It's located in the slide on the top. And if you think about pinball and the plunger that you pull back and then release it, for those of you that are old enough to remember what pinball is, that's how this is fired. So essentially, pulling the trigger does absolutely nothing unless the gun has already been cycled. So again, if I remove the magazine and cycle the action, as if I was loading it, when I pull the trigger, you'll hear, you won't see anything, there's nothing to see, but if you listen, click, right? We have an audible click. Again, if I were to hold the trigger to the rear, as if it was, I just fired it, cycle the action, it will not automatically fire again, even though the trigger is held back. I have to release the trigger to the reset position, and then if you listen carefully, click, it fires again. So again, this is kind of like a single action gun, except single action implies there's a hammer. So it kind of is technically single action in that, you know, I just simply pull the trigger and the gun has to recock itself every time. But since I can't manually cock it, it's not technically single action. It's what we call striker fired. And again, the striker is like that firing pin plunger that is released when it's fired. This pistol looks similar, and in fact is designed to mimic it, but this is a 22 rimfire, and this is not a striker fired gun. This actually has a hammer on the inside. So this is technically a single action pistol that's hammerless. Not to throw a wrench into the works, but again, it is technically single action. This is, again, technically single action, but it's usually specifically referred to as striker fired because it's a different type of trigger. The trigger on a striker fired gun is not crisp and really clean like it is on a traditional single action. There's a little bit of mushiness movement as the striker is pulled slightly to the rear and then released to fire it. This gun actually has a hammer internally. So underneath the back portion here, there's a hammer that actually cocks when you cycle the action to the rear, when we remove the magazine so the slide won't lock back again. And you can hear it fire, but again, there's physically a hammer in there. So this pistol has a better trigger pull because it's not cocking the hammer like this is pulling back the striker slightly. The hammer's already to the rear, so it only requires a light pull to fire it. But again, the slide has to cycle every time. So again, striker fired and looks like striker fired, but it's actually single action. Okay, hopefully that doesn't cause too much confusion. The last one, and I don't have a sample of this because I have no use for a double action only gun. I don't think really anybody does anymore, but they were popular for a while. Lawyers seem to like them for police officers because it made the trigger pull wicked, wicked heavy. But I won't get into that. But essentially, if you take a double action gun like this, if I were to take a grinder and grind off the hammer so that I couldn't physically get my thumb on it to cock it, this would become double action only, okay? Lacking the ability to manually cock the gun, if I literally cut this spur off, the only way to cock the gun would be to pull the trigger. So I would be firing it in double action mode only. So there are revolvers and there are semi-automatic pistols that are both double action only, although I think this day and age they're pretty rare. In the 1990s they were kind of a up and rising star in some circles, but they never really gained a lot of traction. The argument is that, well, the trigger pull is always the same. If I use the Beretta as an example, you know, when I fire this, if I just pull this from my holster as a law enforcement officer, because this is what they used to carry, right? Military too. I pull this from my holster, I may have to go directly into engagement. I won't have time to cock it. I don't want to leave it cocked because this particular gun, unlike the 1911, and I'll cover this maybe in another video, this isn't really safe to leave in the cocked position because there's only the trigger pull is required. 1911 has an additional rear grip safety that has to be pulled in the opposite direction of the trigger. So this is safe when it's cocked and carried. This is really not. So traditionally the hammer would be in the down position after hitting the decocker. So you would traditionally, cycle the gun, load the chamber, decock it, and then remove that so that it requires a big heavy pull to fire it. The argument was at the time, I guess I am getting into this, the argument at the time is that, well, that first pull is really long and heavy, but every pull after that, because it's already cocked, is relatively short and light, and that it would be better for the officers if the trigger pull was the same every time. Just because it's, heavy doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. And they go back to the days when law enforcement officers shot revolvers, and they traditionally would pull the revolver out and immediately just engage and fire. So you get used to that trigger pull being the same. It's awful hard to go heavy, heavy, and then light. It's just difficult to train people that way. Ultimately, when the Glock pistols came out, and I don't have a Glock here to show you, but the Glock pistol was, again, striker fired, and it allowed the same trigger pull every time that was much lighter and easier to control than double action only. So again, that's an overview of single action versus double action versus striker fired versus double action only. And of course, single shot is just what it says. The gun only holds one cartridge at a time, so it is single shot. Hopefully that helps.